My name is Tom Hyland. I'm the co-founder of Aspada, and Aspada is an early-stage venture capital fund based in Bangalore. We manage two funds. Actually, the first is known as SONG, S-O-N-G, SONG being an acronym for our investors. George Soros, which is the S, is in the Soros Economic Development Fund. O-N is Omidyar Network, G is Google. Aspada is a holding company backed entirely by the Soros Economic Development Fund. We focus on three key themes in India and currently manage 16 portfolio companies and close to $100 million across agricultural supply chains, healthcare and education, and financial services. But the way we think about those is really driven by a theme around access, right? And so for us, it's really around access to markets, access to financial services, and access to what we call essential services. We are structured as a holding company in our second fund, which means that we have what's known as a permanent capital vehicle, so we can take a long-term bet. And I think what was discussed earlier is that venture capital itself and equity is a fairly impatient asset class, right? It lends itself to very high return type models in a limited time frame. We don't see that necessarily available in the kinds of spaces that we invest in. And so I'll talk a little bit about our investment specifically, but things around agricultural supply chains, building hospitals and healthcare at the last mile. We have chains of eye care hospitals across India, I think require a different kind of capital that isn't necessarily subsidized, but I think more patient, right? So, allows us to take 10, 15-year bets in the sectors that we work in.
Good. And would you say, Tom, that that's best facilitated with more government intervention or more private sector intervention, or a balanced effort from both? Or?
Yeah, so I think, we are very much focused on private sector intervention. And I think what we've seen in India in these very fragmented spaces, if you were in, Dr. Reddy's talk this morning, she mentioned that 86% of healthcare spend is out of pocket, right? In education, private schools account for 40% of all enrollments, even though they're only 25% of schools. And so what we see is actually the government moving from being a provider of services to more of a payer, which is bringing up all kinds of opportunities for younger private sector entrepreneurs to get involved and put models up.
Great. So Sachin, from your particular vantage point, being the Chief Investment Officer of Acumen, perhaps you could just say a few words to introduce yourself and then help us understand, in your experience, what are the specific or maybe the greatest challenges for scaling social impact in India?
Sure. So my name is Sachin. I am the Chief Investment Officer for Acumen. I've been with the fund now for 4 years. Before this, I used to work in private equity, and I was a consultant before that. Acumen, as a fund, invests in providing critical products and services to low-income consumers, and we've done that over the last 15 to 20 years in a fairly steady way, as steady as is possible in a space that's changing so much. We invest in 4 sectors, and we have offices and invest in India, Pakistan, Western East Africa, and Latin America. And we have just set up a small fund for the United States. So that's what we do. In terms of, I think, your question, Shailendra, what are the key challenges? I think there are both internal and external challenges for scale. So there are some things which are internal to the company, and there are some things which are in the environment. In terms of the environment, I think the 2 biggest challenges for scale, or 3 maybe if I can use, add one. One of them is some of these critical products and services have never been accessed by low-income consumers. So it's the first time somebody's trying to bring health insurance to slum dwellers in Mumbai. And both the consumer and the company and the marketing team trying to get their head around how to create this product can be a serious challenge. The second big challenge externally, I think, is the oft-quoted one, sales and distribution. Okay, it's terribly, terribly hard in India for small enterprises to reach the consumers, and even if you have a great product. And that's where I believe many companies falter and fail because they underestimate how tough it is. And the third, which I think all the people around this table need to work harder on, is a government regulation. So regulation surrounding healthcare, surrounding primary education, surrounding financial inclusion is in a gray area. A quick example, in East Africa, mobile-based payment systems have exploded. In India, they are practically non-existent. And the reason behind that is that whether it's TRAI or the RBI, the regulation surrounding how mobile wallet should work is still gray and it's still unknown. And companies like Airtel are making some headway, but it's way behind, say, a country like Kenya or Ghana or Nigeria, where they've sort of moved ahead. So I think those are the three big issues. Internally, I think the number one issue is the entrepreneur. And I think it's a long and hard slog. Okay, you have to bootstrap the companies. You have to deal with terrible venture capital investors like myself. So I think the entrepreneur, that resilience, that ability to pick yourself up, to pivot your model, to draw in resources into the work that you're willing to do, it's not a challenge. It's an opportunity, in my opinion, because there's a lot that will happen in the developing world on this. But I think for a venture capital fund, finding the right entrepreneurs who have that patience. The venture capital fund has patience on the capital, but the entrepreneur also has to have patience and resilience and strength to keep bouncing back. So those are the four things I would tend to focus on in terms of challenges and opportunities, frankly.
Excellent, Sachin, because you've actually addressed two very prominent issues. One is obviously of the enterprise and the entrepreneurs behind the enterprise. It cannot be understated just how much help, knowledge, experience they need, especially if they're a startup in the space, to be able to make sure that they get their own organizational capabilities effectively organized, that they have a long-term sustainable path towards doing what they want to do, that there is no 100-yard dash in this game. It's really about being in there for the marathon, and so therefore you need a lot of resourcing, a lot of knowledge, and so on. And the other part, Sachin, that you also touched upon was the impact of technology. And for that, let me just turn to Gaurav. Gaurav, in your experience, especially in the space that you're operating in, could you explain for the benefit of the audience how you see the impact of technology helping to facilitate both access, especially to the last mile, but also helping to scale enterprise efforts?
Sure, happy to. Hello, can you all hear me? Hi, everyone. So maybe just a little bit about what we do. I represent a firm called Dalberg, and we are essentially a management consultants. We have a social contract with our staff, which is you get to do management consulting, but you get to choose projects in the manner where you feel that the ultimate impact of those projects, which can be, clients wanting to make more money, governments wanting to write better policies, NGOs wanting to be more efficient, but we have to be convinced that that has meaning, that, as Shailendra started this conversation, that there's some social impact, but I think we all feel that, differently individually, but it's a form of social contract we have with our staff. So that's our business model, but essentially we are a management consulting firm, and as a result, deal with a lot of the analytical and strategic issues that firms in this space, many of the social enterprises, many of the acumen investee companies deal with. It's a great question to ask. There's many schools of thought that feel that actually technological change is really the only fundamental change. That if you look at many of the other types of changes that have been brought about in the whole fight against poverty and so forth, many of them are circular. Governance goes up, governance goes down, corruption increases, decreases. But actually it has been, if you look at any of the major examples that people give around real deltas in what has happened, and you'll have heard a lot of that in today's and yesterday's conversation. I think I don't really want to hear more about mobile phones and how amazing we are about them, but it is true. And that is a fundamental technological aspect. And even in today's keynote on health, a lot of focus around how technology is effectively going to change the division. I think one thing I would mention is, while all of that is true, and we've seen a lot of great examples of how technology is a fundamental way of increasing or getting out of poverty, it is not necessarily, as many have touted, a way to increase equality in that space. there is a huge amount of digital inequality, and it's coming down the pipe. You may have a mobile phone, but if you're poor, you can have one app and you have very low data. And every time that kind of service or access becomes more and more important for you to be successful in this world, then digital inequality becomes as important as any other form of inequality. So I think it's important that technology is seen as a real hairbringer of great things, but it is also something that we see as an important dimension on the equality front. But it is absolutely true that if you look at the fight against fundamental poverty, around many of the health challenges, around the challenges of providing access to water, and look at what solar panels have done for access to electricity, it is very clear that this is an important aspect of providing access to key services. I don't know if I answered your second. What was your second question, Shailendra? I forgot.
No, I think you addressed it. The second question was about how to make sure that innovative technology was helping to facilitate scalable social impact.
Yeah, I think the only one quick thing I would say there is, what is very clear is that often it is not the technology. So you need the technology because that's what makes the difference. But the challenge of deploying the technology is still a business model challenge. I think people have been struggling in the energy space for a while, where fundamentally the technology for the last 5 years has become very robust. But actually making it work on the ground, on whether you want to do a pay-as-you-go, which now seems to be taking off, or whether you have entrepreneurs in each villages running mini-grids. There are many different facets of how you want to run a CapEx, OpEx type of business model. That's where a lot of those challenges sit. And I think that's where it's sort of implementing the technology, which is really the tough question.
I think also going back to the point that Sachin highlighted, that in India especially, it does need the advocacy of government. It needs the regulatory frameworks. The reality is that India is a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, a first world economy, but also housing 1/5 of the world's poor population, and most of that resides in the rural spaces. So you need really smart business models, business solutions to be able to get out to the last mile rural spaces. And very often that's where technology is really, really needed. And the reality that also Gaurav just pointed out is that the uptake of mobile technology in most developing countries, and especially India, is very, very high. But when you get out there and if you look at a mobile phone in the hand of a farmer, a weaver, or any kind of household in the rural space, they're not able to use it today to the effect that they potentially could, right? Because there's a lack of data. Thomas, you've seen
Maybe
those.
I could just pick up on that, since we have made an investment along these lines, and everyone here has heard for the past few days and already knows how many smartphones there are in India. So I won't rehash that. But the truth is, in India, there's only about 100 million people that speak English, and less than that actually read and write it, right? So vernacular clearly is important, because all of the World Wide Web's content put together, including Hindi, adds up to less than 1% of the content that's out there. We made an investment fairly recently along with Qualcomm in a company called Reverie Language Technologies. And what Reverie does is I'll use some tech jargon, but it builds APIs and SDKs for developers. And what that means is it allows companies, for instance, like Snapdeal. We actually power the entire vernacular site for Snapdeal, turning it into a site where people can actually type in lal shoes or red juta, and it actually will return a pair of red shoes, right? It actually will know what you're doing. It can go back and forth to multiple languages. We also pilot with Ola and Uber and others, not for the consumer, because consumers of these products in India speak English, but for the drivers. Because here, if you order an Uber, you're probably not going to get a phone call. In India, if you order an Ola or an Uber, someone's going to call you and ask you where to come. And part of the reason for that is that the driver actually can't read the street names. So this big theme around, digital language equality we think is incredibly important, because the number of smartphones is growing much more quickly than the number of people who actually speak and read English, right? And so the idea is, how can you open up this access and this equality, because right now the phone is nothing but a vehicle for making phone calls. So that's kind of one of the themes we have. And we have heretofore largely been supply chain investors, right? We have not invested actually in products. We've invested in distribution. If you put all of our agricultural companies together, we would actually be India's largest branded fresh fruit and vegetable company. I'll talk about that, which means we have access to 25,000 smallholder farmers across India, for which now the technology is opening up very interesting ways to actually plug in and be more suggestive in terms of inputs and increase productivity and so forth.
Yeah, no, excellent point, Tom, because what it's also highlighting is what the panel was discussing earlier, that each entrepreneur, each enterprise needs the benefit of understanding what is the space they're operating in, what is the method with which they need to develop their particular business solution, and actually be able to bring it. And it's not always seen just from a purely black and white perspective, where the enterprise needs to understand what product or service they need to deliver and just make it deliver and then expect the beneficiary to take it up. And Thomas highlights a very important point, that a lot of the taxi drivers, the tuk-tuk drivers in India are coming from these rural spaces, that that's their only form of livelihood and so on. And then you have these technologies which are looking to facilitate the consumer demand. But it's no good if those drivers who have very little understanding of the English language are not able to engage as effectively, right? So again, you have to be able to see the challenges from all the different perspectives. So let me just touch base with Amita next to me. Amita, you've been working a lot with the Clinton Health Access Initiative and more recently with the Children's Investment Fund, right? Could you help explain in your terms as how, from your perspective, when you're looking at the actual efforts out there in the front line, what are the key aspects that you understand, you see, and how they can be helped addressed?
Sure. So just to quickly introduce myself, I'm passionate about access to treatment, and a lot of my work has really been around looking at business models that work at the intersection of the public and the private sector. So one of the most successful models that I've worked on has really been around engaging the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, to improve access to antiretrovirals, drugs for HIV. And this has been, by really working with pharma companies to help them build sustainable revenue models, helping them access new markets, helping them navigate regulatory pathways, for instance, so that it really becomes a sustainable model that they continue to invest in, while at the same time doing good by improving access to treatment at competitive prices for patients in need. What we've done is really seen how to extend that model to a lot of different areas. And through the discussion, I think one of the things that really struck me is that if you look at the social enterprise space in India, it's fairly active, it's vibrant, but it's really evolved in isolation with very limited linkages to the public sector. And the reality on the ground today is that unfortunately the government continues to be the largest provider of essential services in healthcare, education, and what needs to be done now to bridge the gap, really. The government has really not been brought to the table in a lot of these discussions. I think there's a policy vacuum there. And we've been talking a lot about scale, but just to put in perspective a few numbers. So if you look at maternal health care, for instance, and if you look at a state like Karnataka, which is really the hub of social enterprise, I think, in many ways, the public infrastructure consists of almost 9,000 touch points where a woman can go in and access maternal health care. And this includes, right down to primary healthcare centers at the village level to district hospitals and beyond. So it's 9,000 touch points, right? And if you look at one of the more successful social enterprise models that are out there, the maximum number of hospitals they have is 10, 20 maybe. 9,000 versus 20. So that's the difference in scale that we're talking about. So that's the existing infrastructure that the government already has, they've invested in. I'm not even going to go into the challenges with the public system. So yes, they're not stocked, there are issues with staffing, but the infrastructure exists. And I think what the next generation of social entrepreneurs needs to do is to see how can they leverage that. So rather than reinventing the wheel, are there ways in which we can build these linkages? Can we use the existing infrastructure? And this goes back to Sachin's point, I think, around sales and distribution. The delivery mechanism exists, but we're just not doing enough to leverage that, to bring that into the conversation. I think the other question I had, actually, I don't know the solution, is, when you think about scale, I think we've really been talking a lot about organic growth of enterprises. Are there other ways in which we can think about scale? Are there inorganic ways in which we can do it? Are there ways by leveraging government models? what needs to be done to really, utilize the government mechanisms for delivery. I think, so one is government as sort of the provider of services, which is, this whole piece I've been talking about. But the second equally important piece is government as, as a policy maker. I think, again, because there's not been this conversation or dialogue between the two pieces, there have been some not very well thought out, I think, policy reforms that have been brought about. So, for instance, right to education, if you think about it, fairly landmark bill, everyone's been really excited. But what that's done is essentially resulted in shutting down private operators in urban areas, private school operators in urban areas because of some of the regulatory requirements that were put in place. So how did this happen? Why did it happen? This, again, sorry, dialogue is probably sort of the catchword for me today. It's how do we really bridge the gap? And I think that's where, hopefully, some of us can really play the role in bridging that between the government and the social space.
No, absolutely agree, Amita. You've highlighted additional points that go into the mix of understanding just how social impact can or cannot be facilitated. Bala, let me turn to you because I'm sure you can draw a number of parallels from your experience in helping to facilitate what eventually turned out to be a very large effort towards providing sustainable housing. And if we look at our overall scope of where social impact needs to be facilitated, then clearly it's in the overall health and welfare of the livelihoods, right?
Hello, everyone. So, my current role has nothing to do with housing, but I spent 5 years trying to do affordable urban housing. So, what I do now is I head up an organization called Pratham in the US, and I primarily look at fundraising here. But prior to this, I used to be with the Monitor Group, where, we looked at a particular space. And some of the themes that my fellow panelists sort of touched upon were something that we looked at. So the whole concept was, how do you take a look at industry, a larger industry perspective, and try and drive solutions there, right from thinking about the business model and the different players in that industry, so both the demand side and supply side, and how do you get the regulator, the government, to actually play a meaningful role. I'll try and distill 5 years of whatever work that I sort of did. So where we stand now is that, unfortunately, that idea has not worked, right? This data is as of 3 days old. But there are some parts of it which have obviously worked, right? So let me explain what I mean by that. So we were looking to create housing in the 4 to 8 or 10 lakh segment in urban India. And the goal was to provide this to people who earn between 10 and 15,000 household income. We did our initial set of pilots. We got about 20, 30,000 houses up and going. But what we realized is there's a key component to it, which is the cost of land, because the cost of land, drives the whole unit economics, right? So that's my point. There are certain parts of the unit economics, if you really don't, we knew that cost of land is going to be an issue, and we tried to push the government towards it, but, we eventually, when cost of land is, 30% of it, the end customer could not afford it. So we've created an ecosystem of housing finance companies to support the end customers, but those companies are actually funding government-led projects. They're not actually supporting private sector projects. While it's important to sort of take a sectoral approach to the whole thing, what we also realize is that you got to figure out which is the right sector that naturally lends itself to it. And I don't think, while housing intuitively felt that we could do a lot of things with housing, we could address education, healthcare, so on and so forth. But I only have bad news to give on that. That we had some learnings. We got a few companies and we got a few investors into that space. But as you reflect on 5 years of work. It's actually now 10 years almost. I don't think that went beyond 100,000 houses. Hey, that's non-trivial, but the goal was really to get 1 million houses, and that's how we define scale. Because that's my big sort of other big, challenge in India, right? My current role, we look at education. There are 200 million kids going to school, and in my current role, if Pratham doesn't even at a small scale touch 1 million kids, it's meaningless for us. So I think the question that we want to sort of ask ourselves, what is large scale? In terms of directly, indirectly that you're trying to sort of impact. in my opinion, if you're not able to even directly impact a million lives in a country as vast as India, I think, you're looking at sort of my personal opinion is sort of a Mickey Mouse model, because you need things that scale up, across, through a range of providers, but, it has to be at a sort of critical mass to make sense.
All right, all right. Very good points, and I wouldn't look at it so despondently because I'm sure some of the models can be applied in smaller geographies, but it's a very valid point that, in a country as large as India, where the challenges are quite enormous, you really need to be able to build models that can easily replicate, can easily scale, but it's to take into account all the important aspects that our panelists have helped raise today, that, if you're helping to facilitate a sustainable path out of poverty for the 800-odd million people, especially in rural India, you need to be able to think and apply your efforts, your resources towards business solutions, which will help, A, on the one hand, facilitate institutional efforts that can scale, that can replicate their business model, that can ensure their long-term economic viability. And on the other side, you're dealing with a beneficiary marketplace that needs help to understand how are they going to benefit from the various products and services, irrespective of whether it's financial services, healthcare, education. They need the ability to understand and ultimately be able to afford those services. And the best way to facilitate that is to help increase, first and foremost, their own disposable income and so on, right? So let's turn over.
Shailendra, sorry, I was going to disagree with Bala. You'd encouraged us to disagree, so I'm going to do that.
Please. That's the
I actually think this conversation on scale has sort of, it's taken a turn in globally because of the way impact investing thinks, or investors think, and private equity thinks. I think it can be a real misnomer. Firstly, I think most of the time we start talking scale before we actually show outcomes. We're in complex spaces. You can't even tell me that a school is successful until it's running for 15 years and you can see the outcomes of these kids. And already after 2 years, because we've seen a profit line or we've seen 100 people enroll, we start talking about scale. So number one mistake, the reason these problems exist is because they're hard to solve. They're complex and they require a depth of thinking. And you can't just throw the word scale in there all the time to say that you're going to just start scaling. Secondly, this is not always about scaling the model, but scaling the people that are willing to be there on the ground to do things. I take exception with the idea of, Mickey Mouse models where there might be, one teacher and a great principal who's running a fantastic school. And their ambition may not be to run 10 schools, but man, they're running that school really well. And if all of you did that, we would have scale. So it's not always about scaling the model, but scaling solution providers. Harvard has not scaled, right? You're at the Harvard Business School. Tell me how Harvard Business School worked out how to scale Harvard Business School. It didn't. The power of Harvard Business School comes from the fact that it doesn't scale. It comes from depth and excellence. And that is not something, the poor don't deserve just scale. They deserve quality, right? So I think, I just want to temper this discussion that I constantly hear about scale, because when someone wants to put in $1 million as investment, yes, they're thinking about exit, they're thinking about, therefore, scalable models, and there's nothing wrong with private equity thinking. It has a lot of relevance to many of some of the more basic things that we need to do. If you're going to go and try and sell solar panels to the poor, yeah, you should scale it. It's kind of weird to go and sell it to 100 customers. But if you want to provide good health facilities, the frontline nurse that is not scaling her effort or his effort is doing a fantastic job, and what we need to do is inspire more people to do that. And so just important to recognize that often the discussion on scale in these kind of solutions for poverty and so forth have started to take a lens that is not the 100% of the effort that's going in. In fact, 5 to 10% of the effort is what's going in from sort of social impact investing and just private sector models. There's a whole bunch of people who are trying to scale and inspire others to make some of these efforts. And I think it's important that we don't sort of shy away from that. So, it's also about scaling solution providers.
No, absolutely, and I think I concur with what you're saying, Gaurav, and that's also why I said that, let's not think too despondently. very often scale is not derived necessarily from volume or size. It's very often derived from being able to replicate what you're doing in a small instance. And as Gaurav also pointed out, a sustainable path out of poverty for many of these households is not going to be facilitated within a relatively short space of time. You have to be able to think what's going to help them over 1-2 generations. Because ultimately, if you all think about it, it's when they have the means to be able to send their kids all the way through the kind of education that you've all benefited from, then they have a certain degree of empowerment for the next generation in their household to be even better enabled, better capacitated, and so on, right? So very often you have to start with a sustainable model, and certainly for my foundation, we see that a lot. There's a huge amount of effort going on, but where it struggles, where it meets challenges for growth, for barriers, is in all those aspects that we've highlighted. You know, it needs government advocacy. It needs, as Thomas also pointed out, patient capital to be applied. You know, the two are very synonymous. It needs technology to be thought out of the box. It needs the end beneficiary to be understood properly, not just us sitting a million miles away thinking this is going to be good for them, right? You need to be on the ground. You need to be able to understand their culture, their environment. What does it take to deliver healthcare? Why is it important for them, right? So these are all very important considerations, and you know, we would strongly encourage all of those sitting here today wondering about how do I get involved in social impact, what social impact, and so on. Then, you know, be ready to go out there in the field, try out something, join another effort. There are a whole lot of innovative efforts out there, and if you want to start up something yourself, we'll give you encouragement, we'll give you support. But be ready to understand that this is for the long run. It's not a 100-yard dash. You're not, if you're an investor, if you're an entrepreneur, you're not looking for an exit in the short term, right? This happens over a period of time. So let's open up the panel to questions from our audience. Yes? Could I ask, when you say speaking to the microphone, just say your name and go.
I'm Surya. I represent the Lodestone Private Equity Investors. I'm a managing director, founder of India Life Science Fund. And I have 2 questions. One is, maybe this is our problem, but we've had trouble being follow-on investors to companies started by some of you. There's been a mismatch in our EBITDA expectations and valuations. So I would really, because I am highly motivated to work with these companies in healthcare, I only do healthcare. I would like to understand how better to manage that handoff, because we are impatient, so we better come later. And how do we that impedance mismatch? My second question is about the end consumer and the doctors, maybe, or healthcare social workers interacting with the end consumer in innovative new medical devices. I see a lot of medical devices that make perfect sense being innovated for the bottom of the pyramid. And I don't think the problem is only the distribution system. I wonder, I think there's something about economics for the physician, but I also think that there might be some perception that they're not as good as something else that wasn't innovated for the bottom of the pyramid. I may be totally wrong, but it's just a question I have.
Okay, so let's take the 2 questions. The first question, maybe Thomas, you want to have a go, and Sachin?
Yeah, no, on the first one, in fact, one of the things we spend the lion's share of our time on is actually getting our companies ready for Series B and Series C rounds. We invest generally anywhere between $1 to $5 million. And, part of what we do is, descend on that company while we are entrepreneur-centric and under no delusion that we run these businesses ourselves. We do bring lots of help in terms of putting MIS dashboards in place, installing a CFO or a controller, helping to build out a board, help on marketing and branding and so forth. We've been successful in crowding in lots of later stage investors. We've done deals with Sequoia, IDG, Inventus, and so forth, and IFC and many others. But it's a challenge, and I think part of our bias, and to be fair too, there are lots of different perspectives on this panel. We are not truly a BOP fund, right? We focus more on the big middle. I think at the bottom of the BOP, you probably do need more blended philanthropic-like capital or grant-like capital. We focus on a place where markets are still vastly underserved, although there does exist some paying power. And so we can actually talk about, what are the market mechanisms to scale and grow these businesses. That's not true of everyone, and so I don't want to make a blanket statement about, who's having impact and who isn't. I think everyone is, but it's a different approach. But when you talk about some of the more erstwhile, earlier BOP funds, I think you're right. I mean, many of the business models we've seen, which we also find uninvestable, quite frankly, have been set up to exist largely on, subsidized capital, and they may be having large scale in a smaller segment, but can't really achieve the kind of growth that you need. Again, we're set up as a holding company, right? So we can actually spend a lot of time with our companies and get them ready to that stage, but there's very few organizations out there at Series A, that are willing to actually take that longer term bet and get it ready. So I think it will continue to be a challenge, quite frankly, because I know your own expectations and those of, many who, invest at the early stages in these business may not necessarily be aligned.
I actually would like to add to that, Thomas, because I think Thomas is absolutely right. It will continue to be a challenge as long as that is your approach. And the reality of the situation is that there isn't enough of a ticket pipeline for funds such as yourselves to be able to identify very easily the number of sustainable business enterprise efforts out there that have a proven business model with which they can back up the EBITDA numbers or the growth projections and so on. So in our opinion, I think we need certainly the impact investor community to take more and more of a position of the kind that Thomas's organization is taking, and as well as Gaurav's organization and Acumen for that matter, right? It's all about being there for the journey. It's about being there with patient capital, being able to lend your knowledge, your expertise to these frontline efforts, help validate their assumptions, right? And help facilitate a mindset where the institutions, the entrepreneurs, are also understanding that they need to be in this for the long run, take a very measured approach, don't be in a hurry to cash in at the first available opportunity, because it doesn't work in most of the cases, right? Let's go to the second question, Gaurav. Maybe you can help answer. The second question was about healthcare specifically. I know it's not your specialty area, but what it does highlight is this apparent understanding that, just because the technology is available, then, most of the challenges have been addressed. But clearly that's not the case, right? And here we're talking about how on earth is a professional, qualified medical person going to eke out a living in the rural space, even armed with that technology, right?
Yeah, I may answer this a little superficially, but I think it does come down to the frontline business model as opposed to the technology. I mean, I'll give you an example in the energy space, which I found fascinating. When they were working with essentially trying to distribute solar panels, there was a real issue in parts of India where landlords who essentially had so not necessarily a formal, but sometimes informal relationship with people living in areas that needed electricity, refused to give them or allow people to sell them solar panels because they saw the distinction of them having electricity versus those not having electricity as an important status symbol. Now, when you come up with this stuff in the lab, that is really very far from what you're thinking. And I also was once with Panasonic in Osaka, and they put in front of me a solar lantern. And they were like, Gupta-san, this thing is going to really just win the market. And it was an utterly rubbish lantern. Like, this is billions of dollars, $1 billion company, and they could not come up with a lantern because their technology, it was built in a lab. When you have people who literally were building lanterns in their garage, but close to the consumer and doing a great job. So I think this is a trend that is in fact going on in the development space, where the idea of human interaction, human-centered design, technology, how do you bring that much closer to the consumer, especially a consumer that, can't really afford that level of effort So people are now actually building laboratories in villages to test design and interaction. And I don't know specifically your example, but I bet a lot of it is at that interaction level.
And not to belabor this, but even that's not working very well. So Stanford Biodesign builds things on the ground, but traction there is missing. So it's a mystery to me.
Yeah,
Right.
Good point. Let's take some more questions. So, young man over there, white shirt.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rustam Dalal. I'm studying economics and finance at Brandeis. I have a very simple social enterprise 101 question. I have one very simple eventual dream in life. I believe education is key to India to solve several chronic problems around education. So I want to build a sustainable model whereby I'm not relying on external financial funding from the nation. Basically, I do not want to start an NGO. And at the same time, I want to build a primary school where I can provide good quality education to the children in rural villages in India. But I'm struggling. I've been trying to think about a model since the last 6 months. But for some reason, I haven't been able to monetize the financial model. I don't know if this makes sense, if the question makes sense, but in my mind, I'm struggling with how I'm going to generate a sustainable revenue model whereby all I'm doing is providing education without relying on external donations from donors. And I don't know whether this is a question that you can answer on a panel.
We'll give it a shot. Okay. So the question is essentially, how do you arrive at a sustainable revenue model when you're trying to facilitate impact through better education facilities for the rural, right? Amita, do you want to?
Yeah, so, we've done some work in the sort of affordable school space and looked at a variety of business models. And I think the short answer to your question is that, unfortunately, in rural India, where, which is the point that I think Gaurav was making earlier, that, this is really about the big middle, the sort of above the bottom of the pyramid, but below the middle class. And a lot of them really are in the urban areas and peri-urban, right? So in terms of purchasing power to actually be able to send children to private schools, that doesn't exist in rural areas still. So to be able to build a sustainable model, it's going to be challenging. Maybe it can be done, maybe using technology, for instance. But if you want to provide high quality schooling, a lot of that can happen at the urban level where, people in urban slums have the purchasing power to be able to actually pay the fees to make that sustainable.
So here's a good tip for you, young man. And if you had listened to what Thomas was explaining earlier, in this space, it's not a direct linkage between what the beneficiary is able to afford and what you need as a revenue model, right? Sometimes you have to think out of the box and think, okay, who else is going to find a commercial interest in knowing that you're facilitating that kind of education, right? So remember, Thomas was pointing out that for the many rural people who go to the cities and take up a job as a taxi driver and so on, they're not going to be effective if they're just purely relying on the fact that there's a more mainstream commercial model like Uber that's engaging them and offering them positions. So in the same way in education, you could think about, well, if the children and their families have access to education, better understanding, and so on, does that benefit then an organization like a pharmaceutical or a big corporate like Colgate-Palmolive to be able to send messages to these households to say, hey, look, guys, if you wash your hands at this particular time with this particular soap, does that help? Or it could be medical advice. It could be whatever, right? So sometimes you have to think slightly out of the box. Let's take another question. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Siegel from Reading Prosody. We're a language educational technology startup. And questions particularly for Thomas, but also for Bella and the moderator. We're particularly intrigued by the API and the SDK that you mentioned earlier. And we'd like to know what kinds of specific products you see a need for in the language literacy space and how you can facilitate a connection with customers like what I think the moderator just mentioned, third parties who have an interest in seeing a solution deployed?
That's an interesting question. I'd love to chat with you afterward. And can you just tell me quickly, what do you do exactly in education?
We do language learning software that enables the connection between teachers and students, and we use technology and machine learning and speech recognition.
Very interesting. We'll chat after, but we have another investment too in a company. I'll use an analogy of the this for that company based in Hyderabad that operates across Telangana and AP called ExamCheck. And what ExamCheck does is we are trying to build the Pandora of education. And what I mean by that is they go into schools, and these are affordable private schools or CBSE state schools, and we actually take over the entire assessment and testing process, right? So this is not your year-end test, but this is your everyday maths and science and so forth. We design tests, teachers administer them, we collect the tests back, and we grade them. And what we're able to do is we are able to, down to a single student level, pinpoint exactly strength and weakness areas. Following that, we go and print off student-specific workbooks, worksheets, and actually we have an on-demand printing facility as well. By our measure, it's one of the fastest growing ed tech companies in the world. They did 100,000 students last year. They'll do 500,000 this year. And, related into that, we are all delivering now in terms of, these are still simple paper and pen kinds of tests. But obviously the vernacular language there angle is incredibly important as well as we continue to explore that. So I'd love to chat with you on this. Maybe we can just talk about it afterward.
Let's try and get a couple of more questions in. So, young lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Pranjal Joshi. I'm an undergraduate freshman at Boston College focusing on entrepreneurship. And my question is, what are the prospects for launching a startup app or website that promotes e-learning and simulation, mainly in the rural areas of India?
Bala, do you want to have a go?
I'm not, my job is only not to give the bad news, but listen, I think part of this is, what I agree with what Gaurav said, think about who the end customers, who you want to serve, right? And I think if you work backwards, I think it might be helpful. I think that's the point that Thomas also said. I think you want to think about who do you want to try and address, because if there is challenges in accessing internet, they may have cell phones, but they may not be able to access internet. I think you want to start from you might have an interesting idea, but think about what's the problem you're trying to solve for the end customer and whether there are barriers to that. And you may sort of come back and say, hey, that's probably not the right segment, maybe it's another segment. But there might be an opportunity, but I don't think necessarily in the segment that you're probably looking at.
Another question. Young lady in the white.
Hi, my name is Radhika and I work in an economic development research firm. My question is related to Sachin, but in the Art of Science that I created. So I spent a couple of weeks in the remotest parts of Chhattisgarh maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And one thing that I saw everywhere, besides mobile phones of course, was Coke. And so I guess my question is Coca-Cola doing something right in terms of their sales and distribution model in reaching the bottom of the pyramid, and how can we adapt their model to social impact?
No, I think that's an interesting way to think about it. So yeah, firstly, I think social enterprises should look at models which have already scaled, like Coca-Cola or Unilever or Colgate-Palmolive, and think of adapting some of them. Remember that they did scale with billions of dollars, and which people drinking Coca-Cola maybe in the United States actually generated for Coke. And they made huge losses as they spread out their sales and distribution networks in India. But 2 points, I think, over there. I think the principles of putting a pipe into a rural part of India and how to make that asset generation give you a return are the same for Coca-Cola as they might be for an organization like, say, D-Light Design, which is one of Acumen's investee companies. It's slower going. It's been built out with time. Obviously, D-Light did not have the hundreds of millions of dollars that Coca-Cola did. But the second point, and taking a leaf out of what Amita was saying earlier, is how can social enterprises leverage what these companies already have in terms of the pipes which are going into rural India? And I think there are very good examples of that. So there are companies in the petroleum space which are worried about all the backlash that they receive on fossil fuels. And D-Light Design has a tie-up with Shell, the oil and gas company, to use Shell's network in Africa to actually distribute D-Light lanterns. Okay? Now, to be very clear, Shell does not see the D-Light lantern as competitive to Shell at all, because they're obviously putting gas into the cars, not selling electricity, but they see it in one way or the other as something which is non-competitive, but you know, gives them a little bit to talk about. Mind you, they do charge D-Light for that distribution, so they charge them a markup distribution margin for it. So the long and short, I think the principles are the same, making it sustainable. I'm sure we can learn from Coca-Cola or from others, but in a funny way, I mean, we can leverage the government, but we can also leverage, you know, the corporate sector and bigger corporates to make some of this work.
We got room for one last question. It has to be very short, sharp. Young lady.
Hi, my name is Simila. I work at the Harvard Endowment on the private equity investing platform. So to piggyback off her question, in terms of scaling and distribution, do you think there's a large market for NGOs to partner with each other in the seed sector to deliver similar products to customers they otherwise wouldn't have been able to reach?
I think that's a good question, and I run social enterprises, you know, in my fund, and frankly, like good enterprises, I'm willing to piggyback on anybody who's got a back. You know, so whether it's an NGO, whether it's the government, whether it's the corporate, you know, I think the piggyback works well. However, you know, at a sort of at the level of a society, I believe once you're building those pipes to reach these consumers, the more that we can bring to those consumers helps in both directions. It obviously helps to deliver the impact that we're trying to get, and it also makes it sustainable. It's kind of wasteful, in my opinion, for 5 NGOs, 6 social enterprises, 12 corporates, and a couple of government agencies, all to be building a sales and distribution network to rural Chhattisgarh. It's a waste. So to the extent that that pipe exists, the more we can ride on it, the better. A good example is what microfinance has done. Microfinance has built deep pipes, you know, for financial inclusion into parts of Bangladesh, many parts of India and Africa. And we have companies which, for example, are designing health insurance products for low-income consumers, which now go over the MFI network.
Great, thanks. Well, that's a great wrap-up from Sachin on a very important question. So we hope you've all benefited to some extent in listening to the panel. And you know, if you have any other questions, we're here for you, okay?
Just want to take this opportunity to thank all the wonderful panelists as well as a very wonderful and engaged audience.